Today on the Perception and Action podcast, my interview with Paula Silva from the University of Cincinnati. How can stress help a performer adapt and grow? What is anti-fragility? How do we measure it and train it? How can it be used to challenge an athlete at the right level? So it's time for a call to action. Hi everyone, this is Rob Gray from ASU and PerceptionAction.com. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. In today's episode, my interview with Paula Silva. We discuss her really interesting work looking at movement adaptability from a variety of different angles. What is anti-fragility? How does it differ from resilience? How do we train athletes to be anti-fragile? What is the dynamic touch paradigm? How can it be used to tap into our muscle sense or feel? How does intention fit in with adaptability? Hope you enjoy. Today, my guest is Paula Silva from the University of Cincinnati. Thanks for taking some time to join me, Paula.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
So to start off with, can you tell us a little bit about your background and how you got interested in what you study?
I initially trained in physical therapy back in Brazil. And I finished in 2000. And that's, I went to the clinic. I worked with patients for about 2 years. And physical therapy interventions are really focused and well adjusted to address component functions like muscle strength and flexibility and postural control. But what I've noticed over and over again is that by addressing those component functions, not always we get our patients to where they need to be and want to be in terms of function, because their complaints are typically, I can't go up the stairs to get to my apartment. I can't get up the sofa by myself. If it's a kid with cerebral palsy, maybe what they can't do is play soccer with their friends effectively, right? And if we address the component functions, it's no guarantee that, you get to those goals. And of course, at the time, there was beginning to be a big push for functional training. You should train function directly and not just component functions. But then a whole host of questions starts to open up, right? So how does function emerge? How these two things relate? Should we throw all of the component training away? Or should we try to understand how to help patients harness those components to get function out of them? So I began to be interested about, how function really emerges. And that's what got me to my master's, my interest in doing a master's in rehabilitation science with Sergio Fonseca, who studied movement science more directly in motor control. And I then got really interested in that problem in and of itself, perception and action. That took me to UConn, where I did my PhD with Michael Turvey and studied under people like Claudia Corello and Claire Michaels. And it became sort of my passion to understand movement control and its perceptual basis and adaptability and things like that. So that's where I am right now.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, so you were practicing, was it in Brazil, where you're from originally? Was that where you practiced?
Yes, it was in Brazil. And so when I finished my PhD, I actually went back to Brazil and taught for and I finished my PhD in 2009. I went back to Brazil and I taught about 7 years in a physical therapy department there. And then the opportunity arose for me to apply here at UC because I received an email saying, well, we want somebody to kind of bridge the gap between theory and practice. And I saw this as a good opportunity to be in both worlds at the same time. Whereas in Brazil, it was more in the clinical side, and it was hard to get students that were interested in the movement science or the more hardcore basic science, let's say.
Yes.
So I thought this would be an opportunity to kind of be in both worlds. And that's kind of where I am.
That's awesome. Yeah. And I know Cincinnati is such a great group for
I know,
just
right?
dynamical systems and movement science. Yeah.
Yeah. It's such a privilege to be there and working with such an amazing group of researchers, right? So from philosophers like Tony Tamero and then people that have been in movement science and trying to apply it for a long time, like Mike Riley and Kevin Shockley and Tayron Davis. And so it's been amazing.
Do you still, I know you work with a lot of a lot of your research involves clinical populations. Do you still practice now?
I don't. I haven't been practicing since I left practice. So when I was in the PT department, I did mentor students in the clinic, right? So I continued to confront the problem firsthand. What I think helps in thinking my research problems is that I have been with patients for quite a bit of time, right? So 2 years before my master's and then about 7 years in clinical practice with students back in Brazil. So that does inform a lot of my research questions and how I think about the findings that I get on my own research.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's one of the things I love about a lot of human movement science is it's informed by real world issues a lot of times. Not always. A lot
not always. And I'm not saying that the basic science where you try to understand things for the sake of understanding is not important. Really important. It stretches our thinking when we're not overly constrained about does this work, does this not work. I think that's important too. And, but it's also important for people that have the mindset of problem solving for a particular reason to then even grab those findings that were not meant for this necessarily, right?
True. Yeah.
But that people were just thinking about this problem like Gibson of perception. All of a sudden, it may matter. He was not thinking of rehabilitation when he was doing it, right? But still, it is so useful. Right?
You're right. It's totally, we don't know what is going to somewhere down the road connect with someone in practical sense. So one of the start off with, you've done a lot of really interesting things, but one of the things that kind of caught my eye and I wanted to ask you about first was this topic, anti-fragility. That it's a really interesting concept. So maybe you could just start by, explaining what it is and kind of how it relates to resilience. I know that's kind of the term most people would think of in a relationship, but it is a different thing, right?
Yeah. So anti-fragility, in brief, is this property of biological systems to grow from stress. Resilience, which is the term people mostly latch onto, is this ability to resist changes in function due to stress. So if you're stressed, maybe you're perturbed, but you're able to get back to your previous level of functioning, right? So stress still seems sort of as a negative thing. It's perturbing you out of whatever state you are. And a resilient system is one that's able to recover that. So that's resilience. But anti-fragility puts stress in a more positive spin because it's the way to grow. It's the means for growth. So anti-fragility is just that. We see it everywhere in biological systems, right?
Yeah, it reminds me of a lot of the reconceptualization of noise. Traditional way is something bad that masks the signal, whereas with things like differential learning, it's something that actually has constructive properties and makes things stronger. So in the same way, stress. So the idea is that stress helps to make the system stronger and adapt and grow. Is that kind of the basic idea?
Yes.
And it fits in with topics like redundancy and metastability. Can you talk a little bit about how the kind of not the mechanisms, not the right word, but how it affects the system?
So I'll latch on to resilience for a second to talk about that. I believe that not only I believe, but there is a lot of evidence that biological movement systems, for example, you and I, that move around skillfully through the environment, we're really good at preserving function. So if you are a blacksmith, so going back to Bernstein's example, right? And you're kind of hitting a nail with a chisel, you're able to succeed at every single attempt. Even if something happens in the middle, if somebody touches your arm and he gets out of the way, you're able to get back on track and get the function preserved, right? That's resilience at the functional level. But then if you look under the hood, when I like to say, the way you preserve function is because you're changing all of the time at a lower scale, because we're changing our movement patterns at every single attempt, right? So if you look how your elbow is, the trajectories of your elbow, of your wrist, of your shoulder, they're not quite the same every time. And your ability not to be fixed in a single movement pattern is what allows you to preserve the function under a variety of contexts.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
If you're getting a little more tired, if a muscle is getting perhaps fatigued, it's fine because you don't need to use that muscle to that extent every time. You can another one, just as long as your system is coupled in a way that preserves that function.
Right.
So that's the idea of synergies, that the components are coupled in a way that they compensate for each other to preserve a functionally relevant performance parameter. In this case, getting the hammer to the chisel, right?
Right. And so it's, repetition without repetition. Kind of, exactly. Yeah.
And
the movement.
not being stuck and overly stable on a particular pattern that supports that function seems to be an important property that systems have. And that's where the metastability comes from. Because you're changing all the time, you're not stuck in one way of doing things. This seems to be related to resilience.
So do you think is stress you're conceptualizing here, is it like a really large perturbation? Is it the same on the continuum? Or is it something, is the mechanism different? The way it's
have to be. Mm-hmm. So the term stress is tricky because it's so loaded. But by stress, we simply mean some kind of change in context that challenges the system in some way. It doesn't need to be a force. It doesn't need to be like this complete push out of what you're doing. But any changes in context, internal or external, that's pushing you to change in order to preserve the particular activity, the particular function that you're doing, I would call stress.
Okay. So it's kind of so the example you gave, for example, with Bernstein, someone pushing your arm would be a really low level perturbation versus someone, you actually injuring your arm, like pulling a muscle would be that would something there would need resilience, but it's kind of on the same continuum of perturbation.
I just think it's a matter of time scale, right? So if you pull a muscle, maybe you can imagine if you're a blacksmith and you pull a muscle, maybe your resilience won't show up in the immediate time scale as if I just perturb your arm or if one muscle gets a bit fatigued. Maybe you don't even see a change in function. But if all of a sudden you pull, it interrupts function for a while. And then, what rehabilitation professionals like myself have to do is to figure out a way to provide you with resources to potentially compensate for this if you can't fully recover that muscle, for instance, right? So that you can exploit these degrees of freedom that are so many in our bodies to still get the function done. Full of potential in that sense, right?
Yeah, definitely. Metastability is kind of this interplay between having this consistent movement pattern, but also being flexible and adjustable at the same time somehow, which is kind of the key to that, being able to handle those, right?
Yeah. If you don't mind me adding some research of mine that I'm working on writing up with this idea that, because, conceptually it makes sense to think that an overly stable system, let's think about movement patterns just to be concrete. If you're doing a task always in the same way, if you're kind of stuck to that, but the context changes a bit. Imagine if you're trying to hit a target and all of a sudden the target is not this big anymore, it's this big, and you need to adapt. Imagine if you're using a hammer and now the hammer is not of the same length, is not of the same mass, and you need to adapt. If what you have learned is just this one way of doing things, it will be harder to get you out of that and adjust to the new context, right? And I had this hunch and hypothesis that people with disability or children with different kinds of motor disability, the issue is not so much that they move in a wrong way, because that assumes a normal one way of moving that we know from the science that doesn't exist. And we need to stop being obsessed about correcting and bringing movements to the norm. But it was more about they don't have a repertoire that's rich enough. They're overly stable in whatever solution they latch onto. So I had kids with CP doing a fits task, which is, moving back and forth to try and touch a target using some extended wooden rod. And I would play, they were standing. So I was looking at whole body movements that they were doing to do that task. And when the target was large, they were moving around kind of almost as fast as kids, as typical kids. As soon as I started reducing the target size, all of a sudden the difference between them became really large. That was telling me, okay, they're lacking resilience to adapt. What's behind that? Typically people say, it's because they don't move the arm. They move the trunk too much. And now we need to free the arm and make them use the arm like typical people in many quotes. So what I found, however, is that typical kids use the trunk all the time. The trunk is moving all of the time in coordination with your shoulder, with your elbow, with your wrist. And it does move in different patterns of coordination with the upper limb joints, depending on the size of the target. It moves more in conjunction with them when the target is small, less so when the target is large. I mean, there's a difference in the pattern of coordination. They flip the pattern of coordination when challenges change. Kids with CP can't unlock. That's the problem. The arm and the trunk seem to be always together. They can't use one to compensate, to do little compensations for the other because they're moving together as a block all the time.
Okay.
So it's not so much stop the movement of the trunk, but it's how can we promote the kind of coordination between the two that allows for more opportunities for adaptation to tasks and contexts, right? Yeah, so that's where metastability again comes along as.
So would you say they're kind of freezing more? They're not using kind of synergy. They're using more as a freezing kind of strategy.
Freezing strategy.
Yeah.
That's what it seemed like.
Yeah. And so that's is that kind of how you assess anti-fragility? You look at people's responses to perturbations and see how they respond, change their outcome?
Yeah. So this is an interesting question. I'm a colleague and I'll tell you who got me into this. When I came here to Cincinnati, Adam Kiefer, who is a researcher that was at the time at the Cincinnati Children's Hospital, and now he's at UNC. But he came to me with this idea of anti-fragility, and I was like, oh my gosh, this sounds great. Because what you need to know, much more than what's the maximum capacity of a system, is how does the system adapt and respond to various types of contexts that hopefully can end up being ordered in a continuum. That's what we came up with, basically, in terms of proposing a way to assess this at a functional level. If you don't mind, I'll track back so here's my background in component functions that I talked about.
Okay.
We're really good at that, right? So to assess resilience of let's say a muscle, what you need to worry about is not the maximum capacity for that muscle to produce force or the maximum force that muscle is able to produce to resist stretch. It's how it changes when it's stressed. The difference being, if you think about, you get a muscle in your hand, you fix one side and you start pulling the muscle with the other hand, applying a stress that's known. Then the muscle will stretch. As the muscle stretches, it's producing force to resist the pull. And if you think about plotting, the stress that the muscle is producing to resist you and how much it's stretching, it will create a curve that we call a stress strain curve. That tells you, how is it resisting? If it's too flexible, let's say too compliant, it will stretch a lot, but it won't resist. If I keep pulling until it breaks, eventually it will break, but you would have absorbed very little energy in the process. And the area under the curve of the stress strain curve will tell you how much energy it absorbed. On the other hand, a muscle that, as you pull, resists very quickly, gets to the peak resistance, and then it doesn't stretch much and it already breaks.
Okay.
That's not good either, because it can produce a lot of force to resist, but it can't absorb a lot of energy before it breaks. So what you want is a tissue that kind of allows itself to extend while maintaining a good level of resistance, because that will absorb more energy. And the ability to absorb energy is what is related to a break of a tissue. So that's the tissue level knowledge. And then when Adam told me about this idea of anti-fragility, I was like, we need to figure out a way to do this at the functional level. This thing that I just described. How do we do that, right? Because how do we define stress? Stress is not force. It's not as well defined as in tissue biomechanics. So the way we've been developing this, and NIH has funded us to try and develop something like this, is to get people to perform a task. And now, the task we're doing is navigation through an environment full of virtual characters that's moving around trying to block your way because we're interested in sports medicine problems. So imagine you're fully unencumbered, running from one side of a very big lab to another side with the goal of arriving at the same time as a ball to kick a ball. So a ball is moving and you need to get there to kick that ball. So you have that goal, but then you're going to meet an environment that will vary in the level of challenge for you to get there. If the environment has nothing, it's uncluttered, that's a level of stress that's very low, right? You just have to get there. But if I put like one virtual character trying to intercept you and not let you get there, that's another level of challenge. If I put 2, if I put 3, at the easiest level, stress or challenge could be the number of obstacles that you need to intercept. But because we're trying to take advantage of a lot of people's work out there, like B. Warren's navigation or behavioral dynamics, we make those virtual characters driven by behavioral dynamics. So you participant work as their attractor. So they try to intercept your way, right? So we can make that behavioral dynamic more or less responsive to you. So even if you fix the number of athletes and virtual characters in the field, we can make them more or less responsive to where you are, making it harder and harder and harder for you to do that task. So we're creating athletes with different capabilities. So if I want to get to you, my capability of actually turning and getting to you can be higher or lower, depending on how much I can run. And we're also able to manipulate using AI how much they know of where you're going to be in the future. So instead of them trying to pursue where you are now, they can pursue where you're going to be.
So yeah, you're using kind of the different control laws and parameters for the AI
to create the difficulty.
To be them more smarter and more.
It's like making smarter opponents in the field. So
that's
that
cool.
would be your stress. And then what we want to see, how does that change your performance so that we can plot stress on the x-axis, have stress on the x-axis in a continuum, and how your performance changes, just like the attendance situation. If we see that as I probe you, you all of a sudden become a little better because it's harnessing your capabilities a bit more. Maybe you got to the waypoint faster. Maybe patterns of searching the environment becomes more effective. When I stress you, that's evidence for anti-fragility because I'm stressing you and I see growth in performance or in any of the supporting functions of that performance. That to me would be, we see anti-fragility right there happening.
Right. Yeah, I really like that analogy. And I saw that in some of your papers, the area under the curve, because I think if I'm reading it right way, it allows for different, patterns, right? Because you're taking the energy absorbed by the muscle. It could absorb it in a lot at first and more later.
Different way, more later. Yeah.
So that's really interesting. And the other thing it brings to mind is sometimes I contrast adjustability versus adaptability. So to me, like resilience is like, as the start of the word applies, it's like trying to stick with what you're doing, being really trying to get back to your original thing and being kind of stubborn about it. Whereas anti-fragility is like being creative and trying something completely different because of this new situation. Yeah. That's really cool.
We basically would like to, the one of the problems that this paradigm lends itself to is prevention of injury in sports. Because a lot of injuries happen because athletes are so focused on getting their tasks done that they sometimes, for example, collide unintentionally with an opponent because they just didn't see that coming. Colliding on purpose does not lead to collisions that are as bad as when you collide and you're not seeing that coming. You just don't see something going on. So we think resilience against that kind of issue can be built up by helping you train your perceptual motor system in a way that allows you to be really connected to what's going on, right? Really coupled to the environment and attentive, not in a cognitive way in the sense that you're thinking about things, but in a perceptual motor kind of way, right? So trying to, first of all, understanding what participants that have high resilience or show anti-fragility under those situations of stress, what do they have? What are the quality of their perceptual motor strategies? Allows them to behave like that. And then the second question, once we can detect that, how do we promote it? What are the kinds of things that we can do? Train athletes in safe environments to build up that capability.
Right. That's really interesting. And are the kind of things, do you have a hypothesis about what might be different? Is it, different using different information, different kind of control laws, or maybe even a higher level kind of this, metastability kind of idea?
Yeah. So there are hypotheses about your ability to effectively contact the environment visually. What are the ways you're moving your eyes, for example, that would allow you to extract better information? We don't have a hypothesis about the specific kind of information. We're just trying to look at the behaviors and see if there's something about what they do that's suggesting that they are actively exploring and letting that exploration guide their behavior in a more continuous type of way versus always taking the same route versus being stuck on one strategy. And then once something changes, you don't know what to do because you're not really in contact with the whole environment. How can you reset? Even if we agree that behavioral dynamics is a nice model for how we navigate those cluttered dynamic environments, Bill Warren already talked about this, the ability to reset the dynamics, reset your initial conditions so you can go somewhere else, requires that you are in contact with the environment, right? In ways that I believe are not trained specifically. That would be the kind of functional training that I think VR would perhaps allow us to do, because we can put them in situations where they don't need to be afraid, because there's no harm possible if you collide, for example, but you can create challenges that will make them have to do something different. Perturb, if they're doing something always the same, then it's going to be very good for the artificial intelligence system that we have to figure out what that is. Mm-hmm. And then we can send our virtual characters right there to perturb the one that you're using, to increase your capabilities to modify that, right?
No, that's really fascinating. To me, I'm thinking of Michaels and Jacob, their direct learning, the information for learning. So not just picking up information to control your behavior, but taking up information that tells you how to solve the problem how to change, which is a really interesting, but we don't think we have a good idea what that is yet. It's really kind of
But I mean, it would be great if at some point we could get to something like that. Because, for example, because of the task we're creating, we're trying to be really deliberate in creating the paradigm so that we can use a lot of the basic science that have been done. Mm-hmm. The task that we're asking participants to do is one that they can use the bearing angle strategy to keep. If you keep the bearing angle constant, you can intercept, right? But now your ability to keep that angle constant all the time will be challenged if the environment is cluttered. Right. So you're going to have to let that change and get back to it, right? So we want to see the impact of those stresses on the strategy. What are you doing? If that strategy is effective for interception, how is it adapted? And how is it adapted effectively? So when people still gets the test done, despite everybody trying to get in your way, which is the scenario for sports, because nobody's letting you do the stuff, right? The opponents are there to not let you use your strategy. So, right? So when perturbed, then what do? What is effective, right? We're trying to use those things in testing those hypotheses.
Yeah, that's a really interesting approach. You're almost like nested affordances or sub goals, right? My goal is to get to the ball, but I have a sub goal. I have to get around that defender first, right?
And how do you handle that?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
While still being entrenched by the other one, right? So you still need to be, that's the nesting of affordances kind of idea, because you have an ongoing task happening, mm-hmm. which is I want to get there and intercept, which is at a different time scale than your need to get around, right?
Yes.
So you want to always get that other thing done, but you're going to have to do something different every time because of the nature of environments, really. Sports in particular, but even when we walk out the door to go to the mall, we're not going to encounter the same environment every time, right? Yeah. So we too have to adapt.
What this reminds me of is a question I get a lot. I got yesterday is why some people self-organize better than others. Some athletes mm-hmm. can solve these coordination problems and handle these perturbations. And it sounds like that's you're looking at why are some people more anti-fragile than others is kind of the same question. Yeah.
That's the $1 million question.
Yes. Before we leave this topic, I just want to ask you about your study. You have another study you've already published on this on climbing. Can you tell us a little bit about that study and what you found with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's so Adam and I presented these ideas in its very raw form at the Complex System in Sports in Barcelona. Mm-hmm. And Yannick Hill, who is the first author of this paper, picked up the idea and he really likes climbing. And he's like, let's apply this, right? So that was our first attempt to actually apply the methodology. Mm-hmm. So he had a paradigm where he was creating different levels of stress or challenges to climbers. And we were trying to see how their performance changed under those various levels of challenge. The goal for him was basically that trainers need to pick the right level of challenge to provide their athletes. And this is done both in rehabilitation when you're doing functional training and in sports, basically looking at the maximum. What's the maximum you can do? I'm going to challenge you there. Mm-hmm. And that's the idea we're concerned about, because maybe, for biological systems, let's think about vaccines, for example. You want the right level of stress. It doesn't have to be high dose of the antigen. You don't have to put like a high dose of the virus for you to get your immune system going. Actually, if you do it too much, you might actually make the system fail and die, right? What you want is a low level of stress that allows the reorganization and the creativity to arise. If you're at your maximum capacity, maybe that's not ideal. So we want to first map out how is it that you're changing as you're stressed. And yes, if the change is such that you're maintaining performance really well up to the last level and then you drop, yes, maybe you need to be pushed right there. But if you're, okay, you reach the same performance as some other athlete, but you're kind of going up and down in performance instead of being able to easily perform at the various levels. Maybe you need a very different kind of way to challenge you than the other one, right? The only thing we were able to show in that paper, and it was our only goal, is that athletes that show the same maximum capacity, that could perform, their maximum performance was in the same level of difficulty, show different patterns of adaptability to the various challenges that they faced. So basically the paradigm was, hey, climber, go up this wall. That's level 1 difficulty. Now go up this other wall, level 2 difficulty. Now go up this other wall, level 3, level 4, until they couldn't do it. And we gave them 3 attempts. And we rated their performance at these various levels of difficulty. And we had to stop when they couldn't do it after 3 attempts.
Okay.
For safety reasons. Can't keep pushing, right? So what typically trainers use is like, okay, so that's the maximum. That's where I need to challenge them. And what we're saying is that maybe that's not the best place to challenge. It may depend, or when the performance begins to decline, maybe that's where you need to be challenging the system. You want a stress that's not too high, that's not too low, that's kind of challenging enough to push and give space for creativity to emerge. Because if you're at your maximum capacity, there's no creativity possible. You're using everything you can. So you don't leave room for different solutions to emerge, right? That's kind of the idea. So mapping out is the first step. And then, of course, this that I'm saying, that's something we're proposing to be tested. Now, if you use this model for training, does that get you further than simply looking at the maximum that the person can do and have them perform there in practice?
Okay. That's a really interesting idea. That does make a lot of sense. So even 2 climbers that could get to the same point in the end, maybe one has a big difference from going to 2 to 3 versus 3 to 4. Yes. And so you want to keep them right at that. I'm sure there's also, psychological factors too of getting frustrated and failing a lot. Yeah.
I mean, that's not the area I study, but people like Yannick Hill, they're interested in that kind of thing, like this feeling of accomplishment, and how if you don't get it, if you're at your maximum all the time, it can get not only physically straining, it can get mentally straining too. And that can potentially impact things, right?
I think it reminds me of the challenge point hypothesis. I don't know if you've come across that. Because there's like nominal difficulty that the things are rated by in the gym, but there's actual functional difficulty depending on the individual ability and stuff. Yeah. That's a really interesting approach. Yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see what you find and more of that work. The other one I want to talk about, I've seen you do a couple experiments. It's another example of a really well defined and used paradigm in dynamical systems coordination, which is dynamic touch. So can you tell us a little bit about that paradigm and kind of how it's been used, maybe a little bit? I haven't really talked about much of this at all on the podcast, so I thought I would use you to introduce it. Yeah.
So dynamic touch, my interest in dynamic touch is really connected to my interest in movement, because the touch system, which Gibson gave the name of the haptic perceptual system. We tend to think of touch in our day-to-day life as cutaneous touch. This thing, if I touch your skin, you feel it. Also, if you want to figure out the size of something, maybe you can kind of open up your fingers and when you grab it at its full extension, now you know what the size is. That's what Gibson called the haptic touch. But you also have this other kind of touch that is enduring and is there all of the time, kind of like water for fish. So we don't think about it. It's the one that gives us awareness of our body, awareness of our relation to the floor. If you're sitting on this chair, you know exactly where your body is, all without vision. And it's by means of muscular effort. This is also called the muscle sense dynamic touch. If I grab a hammer, for example, not moving my hand through it. I can just grab it on one point. If I move it around, I get a very clear impression of where the head of that hammer is. What's its extent without vision, right? I can tell, what's the best place to hit that hammer, the center of percussion, for example. You can tell all kinds of things about an object just by grabbing it at one position and moving it around through dynamic touch. And without that system, we can't control our movements because it's the system that actually provides us with information and awareness of the movability or how to move our bodies, our limbs, and objects. There are very few cases of people that lost that sense of touch from the neck down, dynamic touch from the neck down. And it's devastating. There is a book that I recommend for people that are interested in getting intuitions about this. It's called Pride and Daily Marathon of Ian Waterman. And he woke up because of an immune what's it called? That your immune system attack yourself. Self-immune disease. Autoimmune disease. Yeah. That basically attacked the dorsal roots of his spine. So he woke up at 18 years old without feeling his body. And we have an idea of what it means to close our eyes and say, what does it mean to move around without vision? We have intuitions about that, but without touch, it's more than you move weird. You don't move. He said, it's like being disembodied from my body because this guy wanted to raise his little finger and he couldn't. So he had to go through a marathon and continue to go to a marathon to first learn to control his movements through vision. Because without that sense of touch, he has to look and think, and imagine you're standing, right? And then you want to take a step. Here's Ian Waterman after years and years of training, trying to do that. Okay, if I raise my leg, a force will come to my body that will tend to move it backwards. So I will need to stiffen my trunk so I can take that step. That's the level of thinking I have to move without that sense of touch, right?
Right.
And he says things like, I think, therefore I fall, because he can't think while he's moving around, because all of his thoughts are to control his movement. So I began to think, if I want to understand adaptability in movement, how do we make movements context and task sensitive? We need to understand its perceptual basis. So I started using the traditional paradigm of dynamic touch because I guess it was the low-hanging fruit to try and understand are different types of individuals with different types of disability moving differently because the sense of touch is kind of off. Does this have to do with that? So trying to apply paradigms that are out there that assesses this. One way is I give you an object to hold. You can't see the object and I make you move it around and ask you to provide me with the properties of that object. So I can tell the sensitivity of your touch system, specifically your dynamic touch system, right? And I've done studies of that in kids with cerebral palsy and more recently in kids with ADHD with very interesting results about how the system is seem to be affected in these different populations.
Yeah. So before I'll ask about that, but I was wondering, so is when you say dynamic touch, is it combining what we typically think of the sense of touch, somatosensation plus kinesthesis plus proprioception all together, kind of as one? Okay, yes. Yeah, as one kind of. I guess
dynamic touch is perhaps the best synonym that I see in the literature is the muscle sense, like Sherrington described, which I agree involves a lot of that kind of thing, right? That you described.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'll use it a lot in sports and a term feel. People use that's what they mean. That's what they mean. Yeah, you being able to sense where your body is and knowing how to. You're right to have to think about, just to do a simple movement, and it kind of shows you why having a real executive controller of super fast coordinated movements is not going to work.
It's not going to work. Right? So it ties in with all of the research in the idea of internal versus external focus of attention. That when you try to consciously recreate some kind of pattern of movement through thinking, not through kinesthesia or dynamic touch or, the muscle sense, letting the muscle sense drive how you should move, it may interfere with it, right? Because it's tough. It's a lot of degrees of freedom to control. I mean, Ian Waterman says things that are amazing. He says, if the world was a cricket field, it would be heaven for me. Because, cricket fields, like soccer fields, are the same from one step to the next. So it allows for some planning from step to step to step. But he says something like, if the world was a pebble beach, I would commit suicide. Because can you imagine I mean, you cannot tell the muscles of your foot and your whole body in consequence what to do from step to step. I mean, the kind of sensitivity that you have to pick up that structure of a pebble beach that will need your adaptation all over. Can't do that through vision. Vision is not well adapted for that, right? So yeah, so it's an important system.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think vision is so powerful for so many things we do, but it's not good for properties like that's, why we fall on ice and things like that, where there's no visual information about slipperiness at all. So
Ian Waterman says, if it's windy, I can't get out, because if it's wind, he can't see wind, right? So he can't control his movements to adapt to things like wind, which we do. No problem.
Easily.
Right?
Yeah. So what do you find with ADHD and cerebral palsy in terms of dynamic touch?
So it's interesting because it was quite different results. The kids with CP, we gave them and gave typical kids of the same age objects of different extents, and we manipulated the mass distribution of the object because that's the basis for dynamic touch. Dynamic touch seems to pick out how the mass in objects and limbs are distributed, because that's really important. That directly informs you how I should apply force to move this thing. That's the thing that it really connects to. At least there is some evidence of that around. So we manipulate to see, are they sensitive to these moments of mass distribution, like moment of inertia, for instance, which connects to length. But we can't ask somebody, can you tell me the moment of inertia of this? Nobody knows that, right? But because moment of inertia relates to length, we can ask them, can you give me the length of this object without seeing, just by moving? So by their reports of length, I can tell, because I manipulate the mass distribution for an object that has the same length, but I put the mass maybe closer to the tip, closer to the hand.
Okay.
So the object has the same length, but if they're connected to moment of inertia, then they will give me different values of length for an object that has masses in different places, right? And it's really important to detect that for movement, because you would apply forces completely different in two objects that have the same length but different mass distributions. And what happened with kids with CP is that they simply did not distinguish objects based on the mass distribution. They judged every single object to be much longer than typical kids. So all of them were way off, judging that they were longer. And it didn't vary. The judgments just didn't vary with mass distribution as we see in typical adults and as we saw in the typical kids. Now, of course, I come from a Gibsonian perspective, so I don't think we perceive length. I think we perceive things like affordances. In terms of object manipulation, we perceive movability of that object. And what I think is going on is that for these kids, all of these objects just felt immovable. So they're just judging that they had like this huge length, like they're hard to move. I think that's what they were telling us in the language that we're requesting them to. We're just asking, what's the length? And they're giving us this big values of length. But I think what's behind it is that, oh my gosh, those things are very hard to move. So I'm going to give a big length, right? And I think their haptic perceptual system was just not being able to distinguish the subtle differences between these objects that are required for you to apply forces more effectively and more adaptively. And kids with the typical kids were able to do that. So if they have to move an object and manipulate an object like that, they can do it with much more precision. They can perceive the nuanced differences in the mass distribution of these objects, just critical for their control, right?
Mm-hmm. That's really interesting. So it's not one hunch I might have had is at first when you started, is they were kind of just using a different information source, like a lower order. But it seems, I think your affordance explanation is really something different altogether, right? They're just...
they might. I'm not saying your hypothesis, I think, is in need of testing. They're just detecting something else. That's a possibility. Or maybe they're detecting the affordance of movability, and it got to a point, and maybe those objects were just at a higher range for their capabilities that they were just, from this point on, they just feel immovable. So they're providing the same. It's interesting. If you look at the plots at the paper, you see that's basically a flat line. The average judgments of these kids, they're just not changing with the inertia. They're just, maybe they would change if I use another variable there, but none of the mass variables were helping. So I can't say it's mass. I can't say it's static moment. None of those that are highly correlated really in this study were helping. So it could be the case that, let's say, if we gave them much lighter objects, maybe you would see the distinction there because it's more in the range of their capabilities. Who knows? But in that range, It just seemed that they were simply receiving the affordance of movability, and they got to that critical point where you can vary however you want this thing. It just feels immovable for me. Right? So they were not changing the response.
That's really interesting. The last kind of topic I wanted to ask you about is you have a really nice chapter I read in the recent handbook of embodied cognition, where you're talking about you get a lot of people talking about intention, the role of intention and all of this, and how it relates to action. And I really like you kind of talk about how you can frame it in an ecological view instead of the traditional cognitive top-down role of attention. So can you maybe just tell us a little bit about how you think about that, how that fits in with your kind of ideas?
So that chapter, the topic of intention is tricky. I'm not going to claim I know about intention. In most of my research, I have to start with that. I assume an intention. I tell the participant, hey, try to get to the waypoint and do this task. And I am assuming that intention is there. And now I'm trying to figure out how is it that he or she will fulfill that intention. So that's basically my work. I assume an intention. And then we can, on one end, think that to fulfill that intention, I have to plan in a computational kind of way what I need to do to get my intention fulfilled. Or I can capitalize on a source of knowledge that is in our environment, which are affordances, and capitalize on those affordances to fulfill my intentions in a non-computational kind of way. Because I directly perceive affordances, and because information is lawful and can directly control action, then I don't need computational planning to fulfill intentions, right? It's perceptual coupling with the environment that kind of drives how you do things. So what we need to figure out is like, what are the perceptual processes that make that possible? Under what conditions we can make them more efficient, so on and so forth. So those to me are the questions that I would like to ask from an ecological perspective. Whereas from a perspective that's more computational information processing, it's more, how can I help create plans in the brain that were lost because of injury, for example? How can I create better motor programs, better generalized motor programs in the brain? And that typically starts with a lot of instructions, explicit instructions about movement. And I really believe that this is not the way we should go, that we prevent coupling with the environment, prevent exploitation of affordances in the most effective way if we over instruct people about explicit ways to move.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great way of thinking. I think tying it back to your first topic, you're going to be extremely non-anti-fragile if you have a plan.
Yes.
Exactly. Right. Yes. Your navigation is a great example. If I try to plot a route to get to the ball, sit there and diagram it out, it's going to be horribly irresponsive to the environment. Yeah.
And do you know there is one paper, and I will have to email you the author because it's escaping me. This guy tested this idea in a very interesting way. He had people doing a task, which I think is shooting at targets. And he gave people two instructions. One that made them focus on their movements, like try to move your hand in a particular way or something like that. Kind of like Gabby Wolf's internal focus is type instructions. And another group were given an external focus type instruction. He found that was super interesting is that the internal focus instruction stabilized the movement used at the cost of performance. Right. So the movement was stabilized. So people do what you tell them to do. You tell them, move this way, they do. But that's at the cost of performance. The group that was told to get the ball to the target, I can't remember the task, but that was given an instruction that did not focus on the particular pattern of movement, got the task right better, but the patterns of movements were not stable as stable. They were more variable. Because they did better at the task, it was not just rubbish variability, it was variability that was necessary to stabilize performance, right? Constructive variability.
Yeah, I think that's a really good way to think of it. And I guess the very last question I have for you, Paula, you already talked a little bit about your navigation work, but kind of what do you have going on now and planned for the future research-wise?
You're right that perhaps my primary work is this one on trying to understand adaptability. And I have the big work on this navigation thing, but also some supporting work of that particular research, like trying to understand what are the kinds of things that affect people's ability to perceive environmental affordances, Like my student, Jeremy, who's a fan of your podcast, actually. And he's studying how when you pressure people to perform a task, does that change how you attune to information about affordances in the environment? It makes you act in ways that can put you at risk. So we're doing a very simple affordance experiment in VR where we tell participants, we give them a task. You have to navigate from initial position to a waypoint. And we have very simple scenario where two athletes are moving in the participant's direction, creating a closing gap. And we make the movement of these opponents, let's say, be faster and faster. So you create different sizes of gaps at the encounter. And what our critical manipulation is, for one group, we tell, well, just get to the waypoint. From another group, we tell, you need to get there as fast as possible, right? Or we put another opponent trying to get to the waypoint before them, to pressure them. And we're trying to begin to disentangle. This is not in the optics. See, that's kind of challenging for ecopsych. So that's something I want to disentangle because it's not in the optics. My request to you to go as fast as you can. But that messes you up, right? You begin to try and get through apertures that you can't fit on. So what is the story that we want to tell about this? So we're trying to get inspired by people like Rob Whithagen, particular work, and Hedio and Duarte. They've been talking about affordances are possibilities for action that invite. And what makes you be invited so much more to go through this than when you're not pressed? How can we put this in an ecological spin, explain those types of findings? And they get us started because they say it changes how you couple to the environment. You're coupling to the environment differently. And there are multiple affordances. You have the waypoint, right, that you want to get to, that's pulling you. And you have the obstacles that are repelling you, but maybe the balance in the coupling between the two gets off. And when you encounter things in the environment, you're not a passive organism. You are a person engaged in a behavioral dynamic. In this case, the behavioral dynamics of navigation. You're already engaged in that. And how you're coupling might be a way to explain why you try to go through versus around, even though sometimes you can't fit. So you're going to have to learn to adjust that coupling. The kinds of things that I'm trying to understand. And I have students continuing the work to understand, disability, like trying to understand grasping, cerebral palsy, and how you can control your actions to adjust to objects that are moving and the load is varying. So I'm still looking at those types of things as well to try and understand adaptability in a variety of contexts. I think the common theme is I want to understand how we adapt.
Yes. This is really great, Paula. That's really interesting work. Thanks for taking some time to talk with me.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again for the great discussion, Paula. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep them coupled.